Klaatu Barada Nikto. What were you expecting? May the force be with you, or Nanu Nanu? Certainly you weren't expecting me to say live long and prosper, were you? Well, it's pretty obvious that that aliens are popular. There's no doubting that. We have them in our references in our culture all the time. If you spend much time waiting in the checkout line at the supermarket, I'm sure you read a lot there in the checkout line or those newspapers there, right? And I think it's best illustrated by a lot of our TV shows and movies. And what I'd like to do is show you a little collage of different images from various TV shows and movies. I want you to look and see how many of those that you recognize. Did any of you recognize all of those? Congratulations, you're a sci-fi nerd. We have at least one in every crowd, it seems like. So I had to dig deep to find some of those. Some of those go way back about the time I was born, but others, of course, are very popular. I think almost everybody would recognize some of those. Well, before we get started, let's define a few terms. I think it's extremely important to do that. First of all, the term ET, that's not only was the name of a popular movie 30 years ago, but it stands for extraterrestrial, meaning outside of the Earth. And so an extraterrestrial is some being from elsewhere, a space alien, sometimes called an LGM, which means what? Little green men, all right? That's an almost technical term there, all right? But ET is pretty specific. People understand what ETs are. Let's see, another term is flying saucer, and that's not really quite so precise. Most people understand that flying saucer would presumably be a spaceship flown by ETs or little green men, right? And most people like to use the term UFO. That sounds pretty technical, and it is a technical term, but UFO means actually unidentified flying object. How many of you have seen an unidentified flying object? Well, if you haven't been paying attention. I've seen UFOs from time to time. It's been a while since I've seen one. Look, if there's anything in the sky that's moving and you don't know what it is, then it's a UFO, right? Is that pretty clear, everybody? I mean, so how many people, I've given you permission, I've seen them. How many people have seen a UFO now? Okay, I get a few more hands. Again, you aren't really paying attention. There are a lot of things in the sky that, at first glance, particularly if you're not familiar with the sky, could get you going. Back when, I think one of the first times I ever saw what I would call a UFO was back 45 years ago. I was in high school, I believe, just starting high school. And I was riding along with my father. It was a crisp, but warm, sunny winter day. And we're riding along on a 2-lane road, and I'm in the front seat, and he's passenger seat, and he's driving, and something caught my eye, and I'm leaning forward, looking out the top of the windshield, and up in the sky, there was a silver rectangle. And I'm trying to interpret this, and I must confess, I was interpreting it as a disc, and I was seeing it in cross-section. My dad saw I was looking at something. He said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "What is that?" And he leaned forward as far as he could and still keep driving. He said, "I have no idea." We're watching this thing for 5, 6, 7 seconds, and slowly it began to turn and reveal what it really was. But it was a UFO for a while. I must tell you, I grew up next to an Air Force base. It's around 1969, 1970. And what I was seeing was a T-33 aircraft. They had straight wings out like this, and they had wing tanks, the tanks on the end of the wings. And I was seeing most of that tank. And this thing slowly started to turn like that. As it did, I could start seeing the other wing tank and the wings in between, and then the fuselage. And I thought, oh, okay. So what I had just done is I had converted that UFO to an IFO. That's a less well-known, but still a technical term. It's an identified flying object. And I must tell you that I got a good batting average. I'm batting 1,000. I've been able to convert every UFO I've ever seen to an IFO. Now, I'm quite familiar with the sky. I've been doing astronomy my entire life, really. But I've really been intimately familiar with the sky for about 45 years. My wife can tell you usually at home, one of the last things I do before I go to bed is I go outside and look at the sky. I was just curious. And when I get up in the morning, one of the first things I do is I go outside and I look at the sky. And in between, I'm looking at the sky. I just want to know what's up there. And, make sure there's nothing out of place or anything like that. If it's cloudy, I'm not quite so keen on going out and looking at the sky, though. So I'm very familiar with the sky, but even then I get surprises from time to time. Most people, when they come to me, I saw this really bright object. It's usually a planet. That's one of those things like that. Sometimes I can't help people because I don't have enough information to do this. I'm really concerned, however, when people, they see an object in the sky, they don't know what it is, they automatically assume it's a flying saucer, and they're done. To me, that's a fundamental lack of curiosity. You really ought to be curious to try to eliminate all the other possibilities first. Well, I want to note a couple of things for you. You like that saucer? That's a cool saucer, isn't it? I want to point out that, first of all, a UFO and a flying saucer are not the same thing. Over the years, I've given planetarium shows, I've given lectures and such, in my classroom teaching. I'll do Q&A many times at the end, and many times somebody will raise their hand, and I will tell you almost word for word what they will say would be, "What about UFOs?" Now, what I was hearing was, what about unidentified flying objects? And I would proceed to answer the question along those lines. Probably about 2 years ago, pretty late, I suddenly realized that while they said, "What about UFOs?" the vast majority of cases, what they really meant to ask was, "What about flying saucers?" Very different question, isn't it? But they didn't bring themselves to ask this. Now, there's a radio show on late at night on the East Coast, a little earlier here, called Coast to Coast. You all familiar with that one? It's a strange program, isn't it? And lately, I've been getting up really early. I was sick, and I would be up in the middle of the night, so I'd turn this thing on and listen to it. And because this confirmed my suspicion about this, because the host they had on there was a guest host, but I've heard other hosts, the George Noory, the normal host they have, they will use the term UFO to refer to flying saucers. They'll just say UFO, and it's very clear from the context, if you pay attention, that they're talking about flying saucers. Now, why don't they use the term flying saucer? Because you're thinking they're La La Land when they say flying saucers. It's just a goofy term, isn't it? But when you say UFO, it sounds more technical. But make no mistake about it, a UFO and a flying saucer are not the same thing. And you shouldn't think of that in those terms. And again, as I already said, your primary goal with any UFO is to try to convert it to an IFO, try to investigate, figure out more things. And again, some people just want to quit way too soon on this. Well, how did all this stuff about flying saucers get started anyway? People have seen things in the sky that they didn't understand for a very long time. In the Middle Ages, there were reports of these odd things in the sky. In ancient times, there were. And so people would tend to interpret them differently than they do today. But our modern fascination with this sort of thing, we can generally date back to an event in June 24th, 1947. There was a man named Kenneth Arnold. He was a businessman. He also was a pilot. He was piloting a small plane, I believe, from Tacoma to Yakima or Spokane, one of the two. I can't remember now which one. It's a couple-hour flight, and he's flying along. As he went past Mount Rainier, there in Washington State, he reported seeing 9 shiny flying objects in the sky. Now, Kenneth Arnold, being a pilot back then, that really meant a lot because not everybody flew back then. And that meant that he was kind of technological, he knew stuff. And at the time, he thought what he was seeing was some super secret Air Force project, or at the time, Army Air Corps still. And you see, they knew that we had jets, and they were going to push the sound barrier and try to break the sound barrier. And what he thought he was seeing was 9 special secret aircraft that were actually flying faster than the speed of sound. Now, of course, the Air Corps denied that that was the situation. And to some people, when they deny it, it means it's true, right? That proves that it's true. Kind of perverse logic there. It was a few months later that Chuck Yeager actually did break the sound barrier for the first time in the X-1. Like a rocket plane that they were using. But he would estimate, Mr. Arnold estimated how fast they were moving. He would see these 9 shiny things moving like this across the sky. Now, if those 9 shiny things are inside the cockpit or right outside the cockpit and they move like this, that's not very fast, is it? But if they're 5 or 10 miles away, that is real fast. And so he estimated the distance, kind of eyeballed it, and he at the time thought these things were moving at Mach 2, that is twice the speed of sound. He edged it back a little to like 1.5, but he really thought he was seeing a super secret supersonic aircraft. But again, just ahead of his time. Well, he described them as flying objects, in the sky, flying objects. And then he described their motion as like saucers skipping on water. And I think what he meant by that, if you take a round, flat object like a saucer and you throw it with a spin, you can make it skip across the water like that. Now, most of us use flat rocks to do that. I guess a saucer would work, but when I was growing up, I would have used one of my mom's saucers. She would have killed me, I'm sure. So it's kind of weird that he thought the word saucer was good. Now, what happened next? He landed his plane at his destination an hour or so later. He asked to speak to the head of the airport, and they sat down and he debriefed and told him what he had seen. And of course, word traveled pretty quickly. Other people in the airport came in, wanted to hear it. So over the next few hours, he gave his report several times. And over the next several days, he gave his report several times. He kept repeating the story, and he was pretty consistent in his story. Soon got picked up, and 2 days later, the Chicago Sun newspaper had the term flying saucer. And as far as we know, it's the first time that term was used. Notice that Kenneth Arnold did not use the term. He said these objects were flying, and they moved like saucers. And they took those two words from two different contexts and merged them together to get flying saucer. Well, pretty quickly, word spread, and there were hundreds of reports that quickly followed. Across the United States and then around the world, it looked as if the Earth was under invasion by an armada from some alien race, it would seem like. In fact, there was a similar event that happened then, but really didn't happen until 30 years later. There was it happened, I'm sure you never heard of this place, this little town in eastern New Mexico called Roswell. Yeah, I figured you had never heard it before. Well, there were a couple of ranchers out in the desert riding around. This was like a week or so before. They're not even sure which day it was. And when they came across this debris lying on the desert floor, and this is a pretty remote area. What's all this junk out here? It was some paper and wire and bits of wood and foil out there. And I thought, what in the world is this? They investigated and had no clue what it was, and they went on their way. So about a week later, they're in town, and the news comes out of this flying saucer seen in Washington. And they said, well, we saw something a week or two ago out in the desert. I wonder if that was a crash of one of these things, So a lot of excitement came up. The Air Force went out there. There's an air station nearby. They went out there, and they very quickly pronounced that it was a crash of a weather balloon. And there the thing sat for the next 30 years. See, the Roswell incident didn't happen in 1947. It happened like in 1978. What happened was 30 years after the fact, a reporter or author went out there and started interviewing people and interviewed people with all sorts of tales that had not been come forward in 30 years. It makes you wonder why. And there were alien bodies that were found, supposedly, all sorts of fantastic stories that had never been revealed. And this is when the Roswell incident really happened, 30 years after the fact. Was there a government cover-up? Yes, there was. Not the kind of cover-up you think, though. Remember I said they said it was a weather balloon? Actually, it was a balloon, but it was not a weather balloon. It was a super secret project called Project Mogul. And at that time, we had atomic weapons. The Russians were starting to develop atomic weapons, and we didn't have satellites. We didn't have a way of checking up on the monitoring what was going on. So the best method they had was to send these very sensitive microphones high up in the atmosphere, talking many miles up, and those microphones could pick up the rumble of a nuclear bomb test in the Soviet Union. And they didn't want the Russians to know about this, and so they concocted a story that it was a weather balloon. So this balloon, those things go up, eventually they come back down. When they do crash, and that was what was on the desert floor, but they didn't really declassify that until about sometime in the 90s. It was 20 years after the big hullabaloo, but at that point, everyone just is sure that the government is lying about this once again. There's a lot of suspicion out there, isn't there? Well, why all the rash of UFO reports? I'd offer several things. First of all, there's the power of suggestion. Back in the summer of '75, I was between my junior and senior year in college, and I was staying in town and working, and there was a blockbuster movie that came out that summer. Some people say that this summer of '75, some people say that I look like the main character in that one. Anybody know what movie it is? Yeah, I'm talking about Jaws, right? Y'all remember that movie 30 years ago? Well, there was 40 years ago. There was an amazing thing that happened. There were thousands, tens of thousands of shark reports across the country. I understand that some beach resorts had a downturn in their attendance that year. People went to the mountains instead because they just knew that great white was going to get them if they went to the beach. And that was bad enough, but then all sorts of little bays and inlets and streams. I was staying in Greenville, South Carolina then. There were reports of sharks in the Reedy River. That's the river that runs through Greenville. To get there, you'd have to go up several waterfalls and shoals 200 miles from the ocean to get there. And I've waded in the Reedy River. I don't think it's any deeper than about that deep anywhere. It was amazing. Yet there were shark reports. Even better, up in the mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains, there's an impounded lake up there, part of the water system, and there were reports of sharks in that lake up there. What were people seeing? Well, minnows, catfish, I don't know, boots, tires, who knows what they were seeing, but they were morphing these things into all sorts of things. So I think what happened in the wake of 1947 is that there had been a report of a flying saucer, and so everything anybody saw in the sky was a flying saucer. It didn't matter if it was an airplane or what it was. People were interpreting that way regardless. There's also this belief, what we call the plural worlds. This idea is that there are other worlds like ours out there, and this is a fairly modern idea. In ancient times, most people thought that we were the center of the universe. Everything went around us. And so if we are the center of the universe and everything goes around us, can there truly be another world like ours then? I don't see how, because there can only be one center, right? And if we're there, nothing else can be. So there really could not be a plurality of worlds. But in the 17th century, almost 400 years ago, people decided that we weren't the center. We were just one planet orbiting around the sun, and the sun is just a star. And very quickly, people realized that if that's the case, maybe there are other planets going around other stars, something we've only confirmed in the last couple of decades, by the way, but a hunch that people had. So this belief in plurality of worlds came about. And when I say plurality of worlds, not just other planets, but inhabited planets around other stars. And our second president, John Adams, when he was a young man in the 1750s, wrote in his diary one day a comment about the plurality of worlds. That was 260 years ago. And by the time you get in the early 19th century, that was all the rage. There was a young man you may have heard of from western New York that started writing some interesting stories. His name was Joseph Smith. You heard of him? And he came with this idea that Elohim, the God of the Bible, was born a man on a planet called Kolob, or orbiting a star called Kolob, and he was exalted and came here and became a god. You see, plurality of worlds is an integral part of Mormon cosmology. They don't like to talk about it too much, but it's there. It really is there in their teachings. So this plurality of worlds has been around quite a while, but it really come to a head in the 20th century in many respects. Keep in mind, this is 1947. A decade later, 1957, was the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. But people have been working on this. A guy named Goddard back in the 20s had been working on this, and Werner von Braun in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s was working on this. People knew, and again, keep in mind that Kenneth Arnold was a savvy technological guy. Everyone knew at that point, if you knew much, you knew that space travel was possible. It was imminent. It was coming. Just 5 years before this, the Germans under von Braun's leadership had invented the first intercontinental ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket. They launched it from the coast of France and the Netherlands. It would go up a couple hundred miles and then go down range and crash into London and blow up a block when it did. But the thing was, it actually went up into space. It was the first man-made object that went into space. And after the war, both the Russians and the United States, we were grabbing all the rocket scientists we could and grabbing all the rockets we could. We got most of them, and we took them to White Sands, New Mexico, where they became the nucleus of our rocket program, first for military use and then finally for civilian space exploration. Well, Kenneth Arnold knew this. He knew that space travel was imminent, and if he lived long enough, he would certainly see this. Well, if we could travel into space, if there were plural worlds with intelligent beings with technology, why could they not do likewise and come visit us, was the whole argument. So the conclusion I reach is that people now were interpreting things differently. Remember I said in the past, people saw unexplained things in the sky, and they then would interpret them what they knew or what they thought they know. Now, because we know about plurality of worlds and space travel and all that stuff, you're more inclined, far more inclined, to interpret this in terms of alien visitations. That sort of thing would not have occurred to people in the past because their worldview just simply could not conceive of such a thing. So what are UFOs? Well, I've studied this off and on over the years, and I am convinced the vast majority of them are misidentifications. Planets, meteors, bright stars, unusual clouds, aurorae, aircraft, and it goes on and on and on, all sorts of other things. You know, things like ball lightning, that was considered voodoo stuff until about 40 or 50 years ago. Now we understand it's a real thing. What is it? We're not quite sure, but it's recognized it exists. And there are other interesting phenomenon like that kind of on the edges, the fringes of things, but yet we know are real but rare events. Some are out and out hoaxes. Back in the 50s, it was popular to take one of those baby moon hubcaps and throw it in the sky and take a picture of it, and there's your flying saucer. People are a little more sophisticated today, but there have been numerous attempts. You all heard of crop circles? This started up about 40 years ago in the south of England, spread across England and the British Isles and then Europe, and kind of got to the States kind of late. But what would happen, people would wake up in the morning, and out by the road, there'd be a field, farmer's field with wheat or barley or alfalfa or something, and there would be this circle where the crops were all just kind of flattened down in this swirling pattern. And of course the suggestion was this is overnight some alien spacecraft had hovered or landed right there. And that was evidence there. When this thing began to spread, and there were self-professed cerealogists, cereal grain, that's where they got the name from. These self-professed cereologists would show up, and they would investigate, and then they authenticated, yes, this is not man-made. There's no way we could make this. This was a place where there definitely was a spacecraft landing or hovering last night. Now, the fact that these occurred at major intersections on little roads or near little towns, never out in the North 40, never seemed to faze them at all. And this nonsense went on for quite a while. By the way, the cereologists hit the lecture circuit. They wrote books. It was a big deal. This is Exhibit A there 30, 40 years ago for all this stuff. Well, after about a decade of this, these two young men came forward, and they called some reporters in, and they took them out to a field where they proceeded to make a crop circle in a matter of minutes. And they had some very sophisticated equipment they used. They had a wire, a flat board, and a cap with a hook to wire to, and used it like a compass to draw a circle. That was it. And they used this board to flatten it down. It took them like 3 or 4 minutes to make this crop circle. Not very long at all. And the reporters took the pictures and stuff. Then they called some cereologists out. And they certified that, yes, this really was a bona fide landing site. So at that point, the whole story was up. People still believe in these things, even though it's been debunked many times. Back about 30 years ago, there were some pilots with small planes that would... Anybody here pilot of a small plane? Nobody, almost somebody. Well, okay. What they would do is they would go out at night, and they would fly in tight formation with their lights off. And they would synchronize turning on those red and green lights. And it gave you this appearance of swirling around like this and moving along as it went, you know. By the way, that's very illegal. You caught doing that, you won't be flying anything for quite a while. Okay, but they were doing that. There were other guys that sent little balloons up with the flares on it and stuff. Those guys from New Jersey, they did it several times back 30 years ago, and they were charged with some sort of disturbing the peace or something when they finally they came forward and they got charged with something. So there are plenty of hoaxes. Now, that leaves probably 1 or 2% of sightings that are not explained. But does that mean they're automatically UFOs, or excuse me, flying saucers? No, it just means we haven't explained them yet. So be very careful on that front. Just because you can't explain it doesn't mean it's not explainable. That's the problem. So it doesn't mean they're flying saucers. So if you think I'm a flying saucer skeptic, I am. I don't think there's any credible evidence yet that we've been visited by these flying saucers. Well, let's ask a couple of questions here. Let's just suppose for a minute that there are flying saucers, okay, and there are aliens coming here. Question is, where would they come from? Well, the obvious answer is they would come from other planets, right? That makes sense? I mean, you need to live somewhere, and that would be it. So these are aliens from other planets, if not in our solar system, maybe from other stellar systems. Okay, the big question then is, where did life on those planets come from? And there are really only two possibilities. One possibility is that evolution took place, that there was no life on this planet one day, and then the next day that there was. Life just developed naturalistically. And the other possibility is creation. Those are just the two possibilities. I think that pretty well eliminates all the possibilities right there. Either this life evolved or it was created. Let's investigate each of those. First of all, let's take the evolution approach on this. I know I would expect very few, if anybody here, would agree with that. But we do need to look at it and try to get within their thinking what's going on. Well, the assumption is that life spontaneously arose on Earth. They would think that 3.5 billion years ago there was nothing, no living thing on the Earth, and then the next day there was. And after 3.5 billion years, look around. This is us. We're the product of 3.5 billion years of evolution. We're in trouble, right? All right. The question is, if life then evolved on the Earth, then did it arise elsewhere? And there are two possible answers to that question. One of them is no, which then makes, by definition, life unique to the Earth, doesn't it? And if life is unique to the Earth, doesn't it make the Earth very special at that point? And if the Earth is very special in any respect, that kind of leads you right back to creation, doesn't it? So consequently, that's not a palatable option for people who believe in evolution. People who believe in evolution realize that, hey, if life only exists here, we have a problem. So most people, not every people, but the vast majority of people who believe in evolution believe that life has arisen elsewhere. So right away, the evolution model predicts that life should exist somewhere else in the universe. Now, can we test that prediction? And I think we can, not with complete confidence, but not with complete data yet, but we do have some data, and we'll come back to talk about that in a little bit. Now, so the argument is that wherever conditions for life are right, life inevitably comes about, is the whole argument given there. So the conclusion is, not only does life exist in the universe, but probably intelligent life exists. Now, to be true, to be honest here, if evolution did happen, on some planets it might end in clams or cockroaches, right? It may not get any farther than that, and clams and cockroaches aren't terribly good at building spacecraft, are they? So you got to realize that not every place with life will have intelligent life. In fact, sometimes people think the jury is still out on this planet if there's intelligent life. That's a very important question. All right, how does this idea drive science, this idea that life is abundant out there? Well, I'll give you several examples. One of them is SETI. SETI stands for what? Anybody know? Very good. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The idea is this. We have been broadcasting radio of all forms for about nearly 100 years now. So presumably, if you're on a planet orbiting another star within 100 years, light years away, maybe 50 or 60 light years away, and you turn a radio telescope towards the sun, you're not going to see the Earth, but the Earth is there. If you have a very good tuner, you can filter out the garbage, and you're left, well, maybe the signal you're going to end up with is garbage, to know what you think, but you could pick up AM broadcasts and television broadcasts. You know, if you're 60 light years away, you could catch first-run episodes of I Love Lucy, right? So they could actually eavesdrop on our communications. Well, we can turn that around. If there's intelligent life out there, at some point, their technology, probably before they develop space travel, but even afterwards, when they have space travel, they will be broadcasting in the radio part of the spectrum, aren't they? So all we have to do is equip our radio telescopes with receivers looking at the proper band passes and search for those signals. The first such experiment was done in 1960, a man named Frank Drake, and it's picked up pace since then. Over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been almost a continual sifting of data coming in. I think there's probably gigabytes or terabytes of data on all of this. About 20 years ago, there's this rage people could download on their desktop computers and assist sifting through all this. So with all these observations we've made, how many intelligent signals have we received from elsewhere? Zero. Unless you believe those newspapers you read in the supermarket checkout land, right? But we've had zero. Okay, that's pretty strong evidence. We'll come back to that later. Another thing is various Mars probe. Back when I was between 5th and 6th grade, I got my weekly reader during the summer, and they still have my weekly reader at schools. I haven't heard about it in years, but it's a cool little magazine for kids. And that summer of 1965, they had the first probe that went to Mars, the Mariner 4. It flew past, took some photographs, and I had a little map, and I could go outside at night, and I could see Mars, a bright star up in the sky. First planet I ever saw back there when I was just 10 years old. Well, when they flew past Mars, they were thinking Mars was Earth-like. When they flew past, you know what they saw with the photographs they took? A bunch of craters. It looked moon-like, not Earth-like. So they went back 2 years later with another space probe and took some more pictures. And they went back 2 years later, in 1969, with some space probes that orbit around the planet and got a lot of reconnaissance. Again, 2 years later in 71, they did it again. And then finally, in 1976, we landed the two Viking probes on the surface of Mars in two different places. They took all sorts of weather measurements. They also did some very sophisticated life experiments. And by the way, each one of these probes, when they did it, like when they culminated in the life experiments, what were the results? Negative, no life. So we took a 20-year hiatus, and then in 96 we sent another space probe. In 97, 98, 99, we've had almost a continual presence the last 2 decades. Got these little rovers running around. I think from here on out, we've had it for several years now, continual reconnaissance on the surface of Mars, and that's probably going to continue from here on out, I would think. And what do you always hear in these reports? Why are they going to Mars? To look for life. You know, every time we do that, we've been doing it for 50 years, the door gets slammed shut on life on Mars. How many doors how many times do you have the door slammed shut on your face before you get the message, maybe there's no life here? These people are more persistent than any door-to-door salesman you've ever known. All right, so they're not taking no for an answer. Mars seems to be the last great hope for life elsewhere in the solar system, and the conditions there are so bad. I'm pretty certain you'll never find any life there. But they keep doing it anyway. Don't get me wrong, I love Mars. I think it's a wonderful planet. I really support the exploration. But don't snow me with all this boilerplate about life. It's not there, but it's a cool planet to explore otherwise. Okay, they always keep looking for liquid water. Europa is just one of the first places they thought they might see it. Europa is one of the satellites or moons of Jupiter. Now, water is the most abundant molecule in the universe. It also is an essential ingredient of life. Our bodies are like 80% water. There are some reasons for that. Water is an amazing substance. It's a universal solvent, and we can't conceive of life without water, liquid water. And so the gold standard for looking for evidence for life anywhere in the universe is to find liquid water. As I said, water is the most abundant molecule in the universe. We see it all over the place. Except everywhere we see it, it's in the solid form, ice, or it's in the gas form, like steam. As far as we know, the only place in the entire universe where liquid water exists is where? On the Earth. I know in California you sometimes wonder about that, but there's a lot of water on the Earth. And so consequently, that's remarkable. They've not yet found anywhere where liquid water exists at all, let alone in abundance like we have here on the Earth. But that's what they keep searching for out there. Then there's a search for extrasolar planets. That started up in earnest in the early 90s. These are planets orbiting other stars. Extrasolar meaning outside the solar system, outside the sun. And we now have about 2,000 planets, known planets orbiting other stars. A lot of statistics there on all that. I'll come back a little later on and talk more about that. Then finally, there's this field of science they call astrobiology. And if you look it up, by definition, astrobiology is a study of life elsewhere in the universe. Did you know you can get a Ph.D. in astrobiology now? I'm serious. Well, University of Washington is one of those. They have a joint program between the biology department and the astronomy department. You can actually get a Ph.D., associate diploma, in astrobiology. They have scientific conferences in astrobiology. I go to the American Astronomical Society meetings from time to time. They go twice a year. I don't go to all of those. But when I do, they often have sessions, sometimes multiple sessions on astrobiology. And I can't help myself. I got to go to those. They are a hoot. There are 2 journals out there. One's called Astrobiology, and the other one's called, I think, the Journal of Astrobiology. One's a quarterly, and the other one comes out 6 times a year. They've been around for 12, 15 years. One of them 12, one for 15 years. Every issue all jam-packed with all these articles about astrobiology. Now, what did I define astrobiology to be again? It was the study of what? Life elsewhere in the universe. How much life have we found outside the Earth in the universe? We haven't found any. 0. So apparently astrobiology is the only science for which there is no data. It's amazing. It's amazing. So that's the way it's driving science today. Science falsely so called, I believe, in many Christians. Okay, go back to the other question. We asked the question, what if, where did life come from on other planets? One possibility is evolution. The other possibility is creation. And so we asked the question, did God create life elsewhere? And that really is not a scientific issue, I don't think. It's more of a theological issue. If you believe in creation, then you understand that life only comes from God or from living things once God has created those things. But you know what? When I read the Bible, it appears to me that God's attention is centered on mankind. All right? It's centered on mankind. And also it appears if there were ETs out there, and they're intelligent, as intelligent as we are, if not more so, and they're able to communicate, they're social creatures, they have all these things similar to us. So you have to ask the question, are these fallen creatures? Are they in need of salvation? Okay, I can't fathom beings out there like us without souls. I really can't fathom that sort of things. If God created them, I think he's desirous of a relationship with them as well as he is with us. So the question is, are they in need of salvation? And if so, there really are a couple of possibilities. One of them is because of Adam's sin. Sin entered the world through the disobedience of one man. And of course, through the obedience of one man, that last Adam, all could be made alive, right? Death through sin through one man, resurrection life through the last Adam. So, if that's the case, you have to realize that to them, we're the ETs, aren't we? Right? We're the aliens. So could you imagine on a planet out there where you want to share the gospel with people? And wouldn't your gospel message, if it's because of Adam's sin and Jesus' finished work on the cross, wouldn't your gospel message start off something like this? A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. I mean, that starts to make Mormon theology sound a little sane, doesn't it, at that point? So, I mean, this is just crazy. If someone came to you and talked about, the need of salvation, somebody paid for your penalty of sin on some distant planet, you would think that's bizarre. And indeed it is. But even more to the point, it was important that Jesus come here and be one of us. He wants to redeem Adam's race. It's important that he become one of Adam's race, wasn't it? That's a key part of the salvation message, I do believe. So, well, maybe what happened there was it wasn't because of Adam's sin, but because sin was introduced on their planet. There was some Adam-like creature there, and he sinned, and he fell in bringing sin into the world. Now, what would that then necessitate? It would mean that Jesus would have to, when he got done here, he would have to go to this planet to be born a virgin and live a perfect life, lay down his life, the penalty for sin, raise from the dead, and then ascend off the planet to go to another planet and do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, right? Question. According to the New Testament, did Jesus leave this planet to go do it on another planet? No. Where did Jesus go? Ascended to heaven to be on the right hand of the Father, did he not? So I believe, based on Scripture, quite literally, Jesus died once for all. So we've eliminated the possibility of Adam's sin. We eliminated the possibility of their own sin. So that means that they must not be sinful. And some people might think, well, maybe these beings never fell. And maybe that's a possibility. But if that's the case, then you have a problem because, Romans 8 speaks of the taint of sin over the entire creation. It talks about the entire creation. That includes everything, I think. Otherwise, why would you say entire creation? Groaning under this burden of sin. You see, the world, its cosmos itself, requires redemption. I think that's the reason why there will be a new heaven and a new earth, because it requires redemption. The entire thing needs redemption because of the penalty of sin. So you've got these sinless creatures living in a world that's corrupted by the taint of sin, and that's a problem. So I think pretty well I boxed it out. I believe theologically, can't turn to a chapter and verse and say there are no aliens, thus says the Lord. But I think we can take these biblical principles and apply them to reach a conclusion that we're probably not there. Well, let's come back a second and let's talk about something else. Remember I mentioned Frank Drake back in 1960 did the very first SETI experiment? Well, a year later, 1961, he published his famous Drake equation. You see, he was trying to quantify the possibility, the probabilities of finding any sort of signals out there. And so he came up with this equation. It has n on the left, and then it's a number, and then on the right are 7 terms multiplied together. Now, this is not really high math. I'll go through this very quickly. It's not important terribly. Just remember, it's a product of 7 numbers. That's all it is. N is the number of civilizations in our galaxy which communication might be possible. That is, we can pick up their signals from them. And R, on first term on the right, is the average number of stars formed per year in the galaxy. And F sub p, the second term on the right, is the fraction of those stars that have planets. Now that F sub p, it's a fraction, so it's between 0 and 1, isn't it? And then N sub e is the average number of planets that could support life per star, and that number is probably a fraction between 0 and 1, I would think. And then the next term, the fourth term, is F sub L. That's the fraction of the planets where life could be supported, in which life actually develops. Now, they're going to acknowledge that sometimes, even when the conditions are right, life doesn't evolve. But most people would think that fraction is, if they're evolutionists, think it's pretty high, maybe close to 1. It's going to be a number between 0 and 1 once again. And then finally, F sub I, the fraction of planets, that's the next term of life that goes on to develop intelligent life or civilization. Again, that's eliminating the cockroach planets and the clam planets I already mentioned. And then finally, you have there the F sub C, the fraction of civilizations that develop technology, that is radio that we can detect. You know, it could be that some planets get stuck in the Middle Ages or in the Roman period. You know, they never get past that point, never develop technology. And lastly, the length of time over which civilizations release detectable radio signals. You know, they were concerned with nuclear war wiping us out, now global climate change, all this kind of stuff. They're always concerned that somehow our civilization will be wiped out one way or the other. And so the estimates of that could be very short or very long, depending on what you think about these things. Okay, question. You got 7 terms multiplied together. How many of those 7 terms do we know? None. Back in 1961, particularly, they didn't know. So how do you go about evaluating this? It's really neat. You write this equation in science, and you're supposed to fill it in with things you know. Well, we're going to fill it in with things we don't know. So if we don't know anything, what you do is you estimate these terms, and the estimates vary widely. You know, if you're an evolutionist, you're probably going to highball a lot of these numbers, and if you're a creationist, you're probably going to lowball those numbers, and who's to say whose numbers are right? Now, they're going to try to play the statistical argument on you. You know, there are 100 billion galaxies, each one with a few 100 billion stars, and we now know their planets orbit a lot of those stars, and before you know it, you got trillions and quadrillions of planets out there. If you play the probabilities, at least a few of them are going to have life and intelligent life. That's the way they want to play this game statistically. But keep in mind what we're doing here. Until recently, none of these numbers had any realistic input. We now have a little bit of input on some of these numbers. But keep in mind, you have 7 numbers multiplied together. What if any one of them is actually 0? Does it matter what the other 6 numbers are? No, it's irrelevant. If you can demonstrate that just one of the 7 numbers is 0, then it doesn't matter what the other 6 numbers are at all. And so they have a vested interest in keeping all of those being non-zero. Now, what we do know now is that we have a little bit of input on some of these. We said we didn't know any of these numbers. They were all guesstimates at best. Well, F sub p, the fraction of planets that have stars, fraction of planets that have stars that have planets, that number's got to be between 0 and 1 somewhere. We now know of 2,000 planets orbiting other stars. So I know something for certain. I know that F sub p is not 0. It probably isn't 1 either, but it's a non-zero number. We didn't know that 25 years ago. We now know that number. We don't know the number, but we know it's what it's not. It's not equal to 0. But then we want to look at N sub e. That's the number of planets per star that have Earth-like planets. And we have information on that for sure. And again, if any term's 0, the total is 0 and N0. So let's look at this. We have nearly 2,000 known extrasolar planets, plus we have 8 planets in the solar system, which to approximation still is 2,000. So if we throw in the Earth with this, we get F sub p evaluated, we get none of those we found so far are conducive to life, though. N sub e is looking pretty peaked here. But if we throw the Earth in with the mix, We have 2,000 planets. One of them, Earth, is Earth-like, by definition almost. So you take 1 divided by 2,000, you get 0.0005. That's a small number, but it's not 0, is it? But I did include the Earth there, right? And I think the question is not, does the Earth exist? We kind of know that already, right? The question is, given that the Earth exists, are there any other planets like the Earth? And out of those 2,000 planets that are out there, how many are like the Earth? El Zilcho, none of them. There have been a few they've tried to promote, and every time I look at it, it takes me about 5 minutes to find several things wrong with the planet. So there are no planets that are Earth-like. So if we throw the Earth out, suddenly N sub E becomes 0. N sub E becomes 0. And we already argued, if any one of the 7 terms is 0, it doesn't matter what the others are, does it? So what's big N going to be equal to? It's going to be equal to 0. So we ought to eliminate the Earth as a control, so I'm justified in doing that, and so consequently N is equal to 0. So in answer to the question, are we alone? I can say this morning, standing up here, scientifically, yes, we are alone. Now some evolutionists will say, wait a minute. That might change tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year. And indeed it might. Come back and talk to me when it changes. You can't do science on the basis of what you might know in the future. You can only do science on the basis of what you know right now. Is interstellar travel, faster than the speed of light, is that possible? And the scientific answer is no, a definitive no. Well, maybe there's hyperspace like Gene Roddenberry dreamed up for Star Trek and stuff. Yeah, maybe. Come back when you know that, though. You can't do pie-in-the-sky science. It's based on what we know here and now. That's the nature of science. It changes. Come back when it changes. But this morning, folks, I'm here to tell you, based upon the best science, best data available, we are alone. That's good science. Anybody that tries to say science says otherwise is trying to sell you bad science. Okay, if I'm passionate about that, you might understand why. I get really tired of people trying to snow job me on stuff like this, all right? I know stuff more than that, and it just doesn't work. All right. Biblically, I've argued that we're alone as well. Don't you love it when science agrees with the Bible? Notice I didn't say Bible agrees with science. That's looking at it all wrong, isn't it? We should always compare things to the Bible, not the other way around. The Bible is a standard, and the other stuff, the Bible doesn't change, but science does. So right now, the two agree, and I love that. I love that. Okay, does this preclude animal life, plant life, microorganisms? After all, I've been talking about intelligent life. And as far as biblically goes, well, I couldn't necessarily preclude those. But let me take a stab at it. My argument's based, again, upon intelligent life out there. First of all, if you go back to chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, man is given dominion over the earth. All right? Also, if you go to Psalm 8, man is given dominion, explicitly stated there, over the earth, over the animals that are here. So if you had a planet where you had all sorts of creatures, but no body like man to oversee it, you've got a dominion sort of thing. There's nobody in charge. That's not the way God works in these things. Also, the purpose involved. There are reasons why we have plants and animals on this planet. They're here to serve us, sometimes literally. All right? But they're here for our benefit, not to abuse. We're given a mandate to subdue the earth and be in charge of the earth, be a husband to the earth, to oversee it, not to abuse it. I tell people I've been into conservation for a long time. I've been recycling stuff my entire life. Back in the 60s, remember everything was used once and throw away? That never made any sense to me. My mom would buy these little paper sacks to send my lunch to school with me, and I'd go to the trash barrel when I was finished, and I'd dump the stained and dirty aluminum foil or plastic and stuff. I got down, there's this bag sitting here. There's nothing wrong with the bag. I'd fold it up, stick it in my pocket, take it back home with me. I couldn't understand why in the world I'd throw that bag. I never could throw the bag away unless it was torn or grease stains on it or something. So I was way into this stuff a long time ago before everybody else got into it. And I believe in conservation. I believe in stewardship, but I don't believe in worshiping the environment. I don't like the word the environment. That word became popular when I was in high school. I still don't like it because I think it's missing the point of. But hey, I'll hold my soapbox on that one. Are plants biblically alive? It's interesting. Plants are never described as being alive biblically. They fade, they flower, they grow, they fade. But they're not really talked about dying because they never were alive in that sense. You know, the book of Leviticus gives us a standard for life. What is it? The life is in the blood. Plants don't have blood, do they? For that matter, microorganisms don't have blood. Bacteria don't have blood. So in that sense, those things are not alive biblically, are they? So you could have, fungus or something living on planets. I don't think so. But at least, things like horses and dogs and stuff, I don't think they're out there either. It's a little softer term, but I think I can make an argument, a bleak argument here. Again, I don't think there's life anywhere else out there. If life exists, God created it. It didn't happen by itself. Biblically and scientifically, I can say that. So what is their purpose? What purpose are they fulfilling at that point? And are microorganisms alive? I don't think so, not biblically. There is a spiritual battle here. I am concerned there are many writers out there, a lot of books out there from a Christian perspective on UFOs and ETs and flying saucers, and a lot of them want to argue that Satan sometimes appears as an angel of light, and their reasoning seems to be, what's the most common UFO sighting? It's this bright light in the sky, or lights in the sky. So they want to argue that that's a demonic manifestation out there, and so you end up with a demonic activity being invoked here. And sometimes these are tied up with eschatology. People have given explanations as to why when the rapture occurs, well, how are you going to explain all these missing people? Well, aliens took them. That's been one common sort of argument. I'm not a real fan of taking the demonic route because I think sometimes, many times, when we get really wrapped up into demonism and stuff, hearing about that, it can really distract people. When I was in college, there were some tapes and stuff, this is over 40 years ago, tapes and stuff going around about demon possessions in foreign lands and mission stories and stuff, and these were being passed around among the student body. People were really excited about this stuff, and finally the administration of the school put a kibosh on it. And I think they were right. At the time, I thought it was right, even as young as I was. This is a distraction of what we're supposed to be doing. We want to blame demons for way too much many times, I believe. So I'm not a big fan of this sensationalized approach to it. But you know what? There is an occult connection. One thing I've not talked about, and I don't like to talk about, are the so-called alien abductions. You heard about these things? To some people, those are exhibit A. That proves that we're coming here. What happens if someone gets abducted in the middle of the night and they go probing into them inside the spacecraft, and it's, I don't want to go into detail in front of a mixed audience what's going on. It's pretty bad stuff. Several problems here. Number one, nobody wakes up in the morning and remembers this. It's always later under hypnosis that they start recalling these memories, and I think, okay, there's some really weird things going on here. But, people have done sociological studies of people who claim these things, and overwhelmingly the people that do this have other occult connections. They're already into the occult. It's an open door sort of thing. I'm not saying these things are real at all. They could be, things being put in your minds. Again, that getting into demons sort of thing, I think we need to be wary of that sort of thing. Also, people have done demographic studies, and they found out that among all these things of abductions and so forth, there's one group of people noticeably missing. Born-again, Bible-believing people. That should tell you something. For some reason, people like you and me, we just don't ever get picked up. That's a good thing, but we don't get picked up. So there is an occult connection here, but, you don't have to get quite so sensational in all this. You know what? This whole idea of visitations to this planet, flying saucers come here, it's based upon the belief of evolution, isn't it? And hence, if you're really into this, it reinforces this belief in evolution. If you go out there and talk to people who believe in, aliens are coming here quite regularly, flying saucers here all the time, you will find the overwhelming majority, maybe all of them, are evolutionists. And it gives them out because, you see, they understand if there's life elsewhere in the universe, then life arose there naturally, it arose here naturally. There is no God, there is no sin, there is no need of salvation, and Jesus Christ was just a man, you see. Those are the connections there. And so there is a spiritual battle here because this sort of thing deflects our attention from the true and living God. And I think that's the real spiritual battle there. And that's so subtle. People, they want to go for the sensational thing, demons out there and stuff. You don't even need that. All you need is to stir up in the hearts and minds of men this belief. And you don't need anything other than just that belief. And it is prevalent in our society. I would like to say one thing. I started off talking about science fiction. And you might think from my talk here that I'm then preaching against science fiction. Keep in mind one thing. Science fiction, after all, is what? Fiction. Yes, it's a story you made up. And you know, fiction, any fiction, if it's any good, should have a message, should have a meaning. The author is trying to tell you something, give you a message behind it. And so when you watch a show, a Star Trek or something, and something goes on, it's good many times when they get done and ask the question, hey, what was the producer, what was the writer trying to get across to us? What's his message there? And you know, so much science fiction is, you shouldn't throw it out unless you got a real problem with it. I enjoy good science fiction yarns from time to time. I'm not a huge fan, but I do enjoy it. But so much of it's based on evolution. Wouldn't it be great if we had some creation-based and Christian-based, biblical-based science fiction? I've actually off and on, I'm working on 2 different science fiction stories. And they have a very, I think, a powerful message that have a Christian biblical message there. Wouldn't you like to have a whole genre of this, books about this, maybe movies with Christian-based science fiction? The only ones I'm aware of were the 3 books, the trilogy written by C.S. Lewis. Anybody read those? Those were written back in the 40s, I think, a long time ago. So it's high time we have this sort of thing once again. Well, we have, if you go to the, how many people have been to the Creation Museum near Cincinnati? Oh, good grief, hardly anybody. Why haven't you gone yet? Okay, you're waiting for the Ark Encounter this July, right? You get a twofer when you come. Well, I've written a planetarium show. This is called Aliens, Fact or Fiction. It premiered last September. And so we have that showing every day. And it talks about some of the stuff I talk about here and more. So when you come out, you need, I'm not saying if, I'm saying when you come out, you need to make sure you catch that planetarium show. Also, I've written a little pocket guide to UFOs and ETs. It's the 19th in a series. The pocket guides are like 96-page books on stuff. And so many of the things I talked about this morning and far more are found in the pocket guide. We have them for sale back there. We still have them, right? Okay, we still have them back there. Good. Check out our book table. I want to mention also 2 other books I've written. The astronomy book. It's a beautifully illustrated book, primarily intended for kids, but it also has I've had a number of adults have read it and said they've gotten a lot out of it. It's color-coded. It's beautifully illustrated, but the color coding goes with 3 different levels. You can use it for homeschooling curriculum. I know people who are using it for homeschooling. So it's a great little book. And I also talked last night at another venue about cosmology. And Universe by Design is a book I've written on that subject. And we have all of those there, plus more. I have a DVD out there on things that go bump in the night. I'm going to be talking about that Sunday morning somewhere in the area, but we do have a DVD of that talk. And we have a popular level magazine called Answers Magazine. You can sign up for our newsletter. Just check out the materials out there. Thank you very much.